being from a country that doesn't exist anymore creates a very peculiar sense of, uprootedness, in a sense that I don't have a reference of a place that I can really call back home.
Almir Koldzic left for the UK as his home of Yugoslavia disintegrated into civil war. This is Writer's Mosaic, What We Leave We Carry, the series that tells the true life stories of migration to the UK.
I'm Almir Koldzic. I was born in former Yugoslavia, which was a socialist state that doesn't exist anymore. It was a very carefree childhood that I had. At least that's what I recall of it now. We lived in poverty without really realizing we were poor, because more or less everyone was in the same boat. And what I recollect of my childhood is just being on the streets constantly, playing games, arguing with my sister, playing a lot football and basketball, swimming in the rivers in my hometown. I remember my parents not being much around, presumably because they were busy, and that gave my childhood that real sense of freedom and roaming around with other kids and occasionally doing some mischief, stealing neighbors' plums and peaches, things like that. But yeah, overall, it was a happy and largely untroubled childhood. So former Yugoslavia eventually split up into different parts, and where I was born now belongs to Serbia. It's a town on the border, in Serbia, but on the border with Bosnia and Montenegro. It's a lovely mountainous, hilly region that's also known for a sizable Muslim population that lives there. So it's in Serbia, that's the part where Muslims live in a more concentrated number. So former Yugoslavia was a socialist state, and this is another thing that I remember of my childhood, was that my parents were both quite young when they had us, but they were both committed communists. They were active in the Communist Party, not in the sense they were active that they would bring Tito and Marx and Lenin home, but it was more like they felt responsibility to contribute to building this more equal and better future for us all. By the time I was 8 or so, things started fading away because Tito died, and then those ideals started disappearing. My parents became less active. So I myself never really got a sense of that collective spirit, even though I contributed in a few, what we used to call them, collective actions, where you go to help build the national railways and roads. But I didn't really do it for socialist ideals. I went there to meet girls mostly. But it was also an opportunity to meet people from across Yugoslavia, and I really enjoyed it. I was a Muslim in an area that was not predominantly Muslim, so it's Serbia. And I didn't really have much sense of it because we didn't grow up with religion at all. We were culturally Muslim. We would mark Eid. We would come together as a family to mark Eid, and that was about it. That's all I recollect from that time. I remember as a kid there were situations where, particularly one time, a kid said, "We're not going to play with you because you are Muslim." And that was actually the first time that I heard I was a Muslim. I didn't know what it was. My parents never really taught us about this. So I remember going home to ask what it was to be a Muslim and who was not Muslim, to then figure out if the friends that I liked belonged to this or that group. And it was a really devastating realization. My response to it was to beat up the kid who said, "We're not going to play with you." I didn't know better. But later on, when the trouble started in Yugoslavia, being a Muslim in that part wasn't really a good thing to be, because the Serbian army and forces were fighting Muslims just across the border in Bosnia, and It was quite tense, sometimes dangerous. There were paramilitary forces who would cross from Bosnia to this part of Serbia to take people, and they did it. They were stopping trains, taking the Muslims and other ethnic minorities off the trains to kill them mostly. So it was not a pleasant, and it was quite dangerous at times. And I remember from that period lots of tension and worries, and my mum not being able to sleep whenever I went out, worrying what would happen, and if I will come back in one piece, basically. So the troubles in Yugoslavia started when I was 16, 17. That was the first stirrings of the troubles. But then I went to do the national service, which was obligatory in former Yugoslavia, and I was the last generation of the Yugoslavs who were doing collectively the national service. And the real trouble started while I was serving in the National Army, and it was really interesting because the trouble started in Slovenia and Croatia, but we had the Slovenians and Croats with us in the army, and we were told that there were these enemies coming from Slovenia and Croatia. So it became really schizophrenic, and things started unraveling very fast. Some people started deserting and leaving, and it became very clear then that this Yugoslav army was not really representing Yugoslavia anymore. Luckily, I managed to get out of the army before they pulled me to go on the front. The way to get out of the army at the time was to enroll at a university. So I wasn't enrolled while I was at the army, so I found a way just to enroll at any university that would have me as a way of getting out of the army. So I started studying at the time tourism and English at the University of Sarajevo. And that lasted 6-7 months. The troubles then came from Croatia to Bosnia, and then I left Sarajevo on one of the last buses before the barricades became permanent. I went back home and I waited to see what happens, thinking, it's all going to finish soon, but obviously it didn't. A year later, I went and started studying English language and literature at the University of Novi Sad. What I do remember is those first moments when people were shot live on live TV, when there were protests in Sarajevo and snipers just started shooting at people. And that was really when it landed, that this is going to be a serious thing. And then it was devastating. It was devastating on so many different levels, in a sense that you realize that this country you grew up in is imploding, that people were splitting up. So, friend groups were disappearing. People suddenly became nationalistic, and this is what I could not understand. And still, to some extent, I cannot understand how come that people who I grew up with, went to the same schools with and all of that, ended up being so politically different and so sometimes full of hate towards the others. And I really could never grasp it. Just this realization that the world has gone mad around me, and I didn't understand how this happened. It really was almost like this process of witnessing a collapse of one way of life that's replaced by this much more violent and much more exclusive way of living that, was terrifying. And also, it took me and many of the people around me years to find a way of coping with it or finding a way out. I decided at some point it would be good for me, if possible, to come and improve my English by coming to England. And I just got lucky because it was really hard at the time to get a student visa. But I guess because I was studying English language and literature, it helped a little bit. So I came on a student visa for 6 months to improve my English. That was the first time I flew. I remember just being on a plane and seeing my country, and I was flying from Belgrade, just my country reducing to this little dot. And I remember thinking, oh wow, this is such a special experience. Maybe this is going to be the beginning of something new. Coming to England was a way also of trying to escape from all of it, or to process it somehow from a distance. I came, and then, I was staying with a family in Leytonstone initially. My host family, they were working class English people who could not have been better and sweeter. They were so welcoming, so understanding. Admittedly, I could not understand a word of what they were saying, or hardly anything in the beginning. They did have their strong East London accents, I learned later, but at that time I was really trying hard to understand. But what was coming through was definitely how kind they were, how supportive they were. They became my family, really, here in the beginning. They even offered, at some point, they said, look, this is your home now. You can stay with us for as long as you want. We are your base. So whenever you're in trouble, come back here. And that was such a big deal from people who, I really didn't have to do it. They hardly knew me, but they were just kind and good people. When I was leaving, there was no intention of staying for good. I actually didn't even know there was a possibility of staying for good. I was just happy I had a visa for 6 months. My intention was I'll just go improve, work on my English and then go back. And then when I came here, I realized there was a possibility of staying. So I was exploring different options, whether to ask for asylum, whether to look for the student visa, and eventually I found a way to stay in. But even when I decided I'm going to stay, and then eventually I enrolled and at the University of North London, it was called at the time, my intention was always, okay, I will finish my degree here and then I will go back because things will get better. This is, a temporary conflict. To some extent, even 30 years later, I still think from time to time, there's part of me that thinks I'm due to go back at some point. There were people arriving as refugees, mostly from Bosnia. People were coming as refugees because it was a recognized area of conflict. Shortly after arriving to London, I found a little community of Yugoslavs who were meeting. There was a club called Golden Parrot in Leicester Square, and that was our Tuesday night, I think it was, club night, where we would come and musicians from former Yugoslavia, all parts of former Yugoslavia would come to perform there. And it was a complete oasis and a strange thing that we were coming together as former Yugoslavs in London rather than Yugoslavia. There was also that sense that whenever I met someone from former Yugoslavia, the conflict, was shaped us all. So everyone was worried about other people's attitudes. You were trying to figure out who was from which part of the country. Were they nationalists? Were they people who were somehow involved in some troubles or whatever? So, while creating those links with that community, there was also lots of mistrust, I guess, and checking out of each other in terms of our political leanings and beliefs. I've been lucky to some extent that along the way I've met some really good people who supported me in very unusual and sometimes incredibly generous ways. I remember particularly when I started studying, and there was a point where, because I was an asylum seeker at that point, and you could only study as an asylum seeker by paying what they called overseas fees, which was really, really expensive. I was trying to find a way around the system, and then I had the whole department at the University of Goldsmiths. This is when I was doing my MA later on. They came together to support me in all sorts of ways. They ended up paying partly my fees, helping me get through that process. And this was all really people, partly for their political beliefs, but also people who wanted to create a fairer system in this country, who were helping me along the way. London also gave me this sense of meeting people from all over the world, and that was a big, big difference. I remember the first time I arrived at Heathrow, seeing all these colors and hearing all those languages, having this incredibly positive feeling of just the first shock of diversity, because Serbia was, Yugoslavia was a pretty monocultural space in the sense that people were of different religions, but we were all of a similar culture. And here suddenly you were coming to this place where the world cultures were coming together, and I absolutely loved it. I met lots of people from all over the world, and we supported each other. Many of them were refugees, migrants from different places. Some of them were people I met at university. So yeah, gradually I was building that network. I would also say that the first year or two, it was also, and I guess that this applies to many people today, it's also, London is a very, very lonely place for someone who comes by themselves without family or really close friends. So I remember just spending endless days by myself, trying to figure out how and what I'm gonna do in this place, how I'm gonna organize my life. And I remember going to see lots of movies. I just remember spending days and days watching Tarkovsky and people like that. Maybe some of it was not always good for my mental health. It was quite, some of that stuff was really exactly what I should not have watched at the time. But yeah, there was that loneliness that I think, is an experience that lots of people who come to England, or London in particular as a big city, would experience. I was working in a cafe. Yeah, I was working like 5 days a week, I remember. So I was studying part-time. I couldn't afford to study otherwise. So I was working in a cafe, and it was in Primrose Hill, where I was meeting lots of celebrities at the time, most of whom I didn't know were celebrities. I was doing some translation work. I was translating at some point for lots of TV companies like Channel 4 and BBC and others. And every time there was a conflict, and we were joking about it, every time there was another conflict or scary situation happening back home, we were getting invitations to do some more work. So financially it was turning out to be profitable. People knew of the wars in Yugoslavia, but everyone found it too complex or complicated, and too complicated to understand. So, there was curiosity, and people were generally, I never experienced, outright hostility. Sometimes people would say some slightly insensitive things, and but generally people were mostly curious and keen to hear more about it. The asylum process in the UK, from my perspective, was very long, fruitless, in the sense that it was just a long waiting game that basically ended up with nothing. I think I ended up 10 years later getting a visa just based on the fact that I spent 10 years in the country, rather than because they made a decision in my case. This dissonance between me wanting to create roots and not being able to because of the system here, I navigated it by consciously deciding not to allow the system to put me in that space where I rely completely on it. So my thinking was, I'm going to do my best to do things here that anyone else of my age would do. So I was focusing on studying, on creating my networks and building my experiences, and trying to learn as much as possible, thinking that whatever happens, hopefully if I leave or I stay, I will not look back at those years thinking I wasted them because I waited for the system to give me this or that. When I think back now, I was a young man. I was 22 when this was all happening. It was a very healthy approach that I intuitively developed and that served me well. I think the question of belonging here didn't happen overnight, or there wasn't one particular moment. I think it was a process, and in some ways it's still a process. Being from a country that doesn't exist anymore creates a very peculiar sense of, uprootedness, in a sense that you don't even have this, I don't have a reference of a place that I can really call back home. The subsequent country now, Serbia, there is a hometown that my parents live in, so on. But I grew up in Yugoslavia. That country doesn't exist. So it's really like belonging to a former entity that's not there. And your references are to some place that now only exists in our imagination. And then in the UK, that process has happened over the many years. And I think every little step of the way, as you complete something, you complete your degree, you find your first volunteering job, you create your first project, you develop your job, you find your partner, you have your kids. Each of those steps contributes to that sense of belonging. And now I feel that London is as much home as any other place. I have 2 kids now here who are growing up as Londoners with their own cultural and other references. I started working with the Red Cross. That was my first job. We were working with refugees and asylum seekers, and we were helping them with their urgent needs. They were newly arrived people who just needed to orientate themselves in the new environment. They had all sorts of very complex and needs in terms of their mental health and traumas that they experienced, but also very practical things like where can we find things for our babies and so on. But within that work, I quickly realized that my passion was really taking me to work more in the arts and cultural space. So soon after, I started working within the Red Cross on developing my own arts exhibitions and projects that were trying to somehow communicate these experiences of refugees and asylum seekers who we were seeing at the Red Cross. My first impressions were that England was nothing like what I had imagined it to be. I imagined England to be the place from the books I was reading. And it turned to be, in some ways, poorer than what I imagined. I loved the diversity of London in particular, so that was this sense, the diversity and the sense of freedom. I find London, and by extension England, an incredibly generous space that allows people to be who they want to be or to create their identities through the conversations between different cultures and between different people and so on. For me, the whole idea of Brexit was based on the idea that there are these others who are coming to this country to take this country from us. So the way for us to protect our country is by shutting out the others. And as the other in this country, I felt that it spoke to me very, not directly, indirectly, but very strongly. And it really changed the sense for me of belonging, because you suddenly realize there's a good chunk of this population that maybe, even though I haven't experienced it personally, that's very hostile to migrants and refugees, particularly people who come from obviously different parts of the world, who are brown or black and so on, that hostility increases massively because, as a person who appears to be white, I can disappear in the crowd if you like. But for people who stand out, I would imagine that hostility becomes much more pronounced. It's created lots of questions for lots of people who live here and who are not sure, that they're welcome, particularly people who have recently arrived. I have a Muslim name, I have Muslim cultural background, and I do have a sense of this cultural solidarity and connection to the wider Muslim community, but not, strangely, not in a religious sense, because I've never been practicing any religion. So it's much more cultural and connected to the representation or misrepresentation of Muslims in this country and beyond. And I think this becomes particularly pronounced when big things happen, like, for example, when things in Palestine happened. I'm still shocked to the extent to which we are able to ignore, not comment, or put aside the whole situation in Palestine. It's a big reflection of anti-Muslim feelings maybe that are there in the West, that gives this and many other societies the reason or an excuse to look away and not do anything about it or not to address it in any clear way. I think my kids are lucky in the sense that they are growing up in a very inclusive, diverse, and open society. So, they're meeting here and they're going to school with kids from all over the world. I remember when they were young, we were speaking 2 different languages, 3 different languages at home. And, we went to the local school to say that, nursery actually it was, and we said, maybe the English is not as great as it should be because we are speaking different languages. And they said, well, there's hardly any kid here who speaks on one language. And it was that sense of, okay, so this way of being where where you have more than one identity is not an exception, but it's more of a rule here. And therefore, I feel that for my kids, that's a perfect environment to grow up in. I love watching how my kids navigate those different identities with ease, to the extent that my son will talk to his Muslim friends about Ramadan or whatever with as much ease as he would talk about Christmas to other friends, because his mom is a Christian Greek. When you leave kids to it, or you create circumstances where you are not enforcing a particular identity or monocultural idea onto people or young people in particular, they grow up really free from those constraints. Hopefully that'll lead them to become more open and more understanding people who also can benefit this country because of their links to different parts of the world, which always creates new opportunities and possibilities. One interesting thing that has happened recently and completely has changed for the first time after all these years, I have to say, that has changed my attitude towards my former country is the recent demonstrations that have been happening in Serbia, where for the first time I've been seeing this spirit that I haven't seen in like 40 years, this collective spirit of young people who have come together, trying to reclaim the country from these populist political leaders, from mafia, from corruption, from failed institutions. And they are doing it with so much enthusiasm and skill. And that really made me, for the first time, enthusiastic about the possibility of a new country emerging from that place former Yugoslavia was. I definitely think that Britain has given me lots of amazing opportunities, building my life here, meeting amazing people, learning about the world and finding my purpose.
Almir Koldzic was talking to Tim Finch.